On the morning of September 12th, 1683, a Polish king named Jan Sobieski looked down from the Kahlenberg Ridge outside Vienna at the largest army assembled in Europe in over a century. The Ottoman Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa, had 140,000 soldiers camped below the city walls. He had been besieging Vienna for 2 months. The city's garrison had been reduced to around 5,000 men. Food was running out. Plague had broken out inside the walls. The defenders were blowing up their own buildings to deny the Ottomans cover as they tunneled under the fortifications. The city had perhaps days left. Sobieski had ridden 350 miles in 2 weeks to get here. He commanded a combined Christian force of around 80,000 men, assembled from Poland, Austria, Bavaria, Saxony, and various German principalities in what was genuinely one of the more remarkable coalition-building achievements of the 17th century. He was outnumbered, his troops were exhausted from the march, and he was about to order the largest cavalry charge in recorded history downhill into the flank of an army that had spent the previous 60 days digging itself into fortified positions. He charged anyway. By nightfall, the Ottoman army was in full retreat, leaving behind their tents, their artillery, their treasury, their supplies, and the Grand Vizier's personal standard. Kara Mustafa fled to Belgrade, where Sultan Mehmed IV had him strangled with a silk cord for the failure. Vienna was saved, and the Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding into Europe more or less continuously for 3 centuries, had reached the high water mark it would never surpass. What happened at Vienna in 1683 is one of those battles that genuinely changed the shape of the world. Not immediately, not cleanly, but completely. This is the story of how the Ottoman Empire came within days of taking the city that would have opened the road to Western Europe, why it failed, and what that failure meant for the next 3 centuries of history. The Ottoman Empire, in 1683, was not some distant exotic power that had wandered into European affairs by accident. It had been a central player in European politics for over 2 centuries, and its expansion into Europe had been one of the defining facts of the continent's history since the 15th century. Understanding why the Ottomans were at Vienna requires understanding where they came from and how fast they had moved. The Ottoman state began as a small Turkish principality in northwestern Anatolia in the early 14th century, one of several successor states that emerged as the Mongol-weakened Seljuk Sultanate disintegrated. What distinguished the Ottomans from their neighbors was a combination of factors that historians have debated for centuries without reaching complete agreement: effective military organization, a pragmatic approach to incorporating conquered peoples, religious legitimacy that attracted warriors from across the Muslim world, and a series of unusually capable rulers in the dynasty's first century who built institutions that outlasted their individual genius. Constantinople fell in 1453. Mehmed II, the conqueror, was 21 years old. He spent the next 28 years systematically finishing what the conquest of Constantinople had begun, eliminating rival Turkish principalities in Anatolia, extending Ottoman authority into the Balkans, and establishing the administrative and military machinery that would sustain expansion for another century. By the time he died in 1481, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates and from the Crimea to the Aegean. The expansion accelerated under Selim I and then Suleiman the Magnificent in the early 16th century. Selim turned east and south, defeating the Safavid Persians at Chaldiran in 1514 and then sweeping through Syria and Egypt in 1516 and 1517, bringing the Arab heartland of the Muslim world under Ottoman control. He returned from Egypt with the title of Caliph, giving the Ottoman sultans religious authority over Sunni Muslims everywhere that would matter enormously for their political legitimacy. Suleiman then turned west. Hungary fell at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 in one of the more one-sided military encounters of the century. 3 years later, Suleiman's army stood before Vienna for the first time. The first siege of Vienna in 1529 failed, and the reasons for that failure established a pattern that would persist for a century and a half. The Ottomans arrived late in the campaigning season. Their heavy artillery had been left behind because the roads were impassable for the largest guns, and autumn rains turned the ground to mud and brought disease into the camp. They besieged for 3 weeks, failed to breach the walls, and withdrew before winter made the situation untenable. The Habsburgs breathed. The Ottoman threat remained. For the next 150 years, the Ottoman-Habsburg border was a zone of continuous low-level conflict punctuated by major wars. Hungary became the primary battleground, divided between Habsburg control in the west and Ottoman control in the east, with a buffer zone of semi-independent principalities in between that were perpetually being fought over by both sides. Transylvania played the two empires against each other with considerable skill for decades. The border shifted back and forth without either side achieving decisive advantage. What the Ottomans did achieve was something perhaps more significant than territorial conquest in the West. Their continuous military pressure forced the Habsburg emperors to maintain expensive standing armies, diverting resources from other projects. Their alliance with France, which began formally in 1536 and represented a purely pragmatic arrangement between a Catholic monarchy and a Muslim empire directed against their shared Habsburg enemy, injected Ottoman power into the heart of European politics in ways that shaped the continent's internal dynamics for generations. The Ottoman Empire was not outside European history. It was one of its primary drivers. Kara Mustafa Pasha became Grand Vizier in 1676 and almost immediately began planning the operation that would define his career. He was ambitious, capable, and possessed of the kind of strategic vision that tends to look either like genius or catastrophic overreach depending on whether it succeeds. He wanted to take Vienna, and he convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that the opportunity was there. The opportunity genuinely existed. Hungary was in turmoil. Hungarian Protestant nobles, resentful of Habsburg attempts to impose Catholic conformity on their territories, had been in rebellion for years and had reached out to the Ottomans for support. The Habsburgs were distracted by conflicts elsewhere in Europe. Louis XIV of France was simultaneously pressuring the Habsburg western border, a deliberate French strategy of coordinating with Ottoman moves to keep the Habsburgs off balance. The moment looked right. The Ottoman army that assembled at Adrianople in spring 1683 was an extraordinary military machine. The core was the Janissary infantry, the elite professional soldiers who had been the Ottoman army's main striking force for 2 centuries, recruited as children from Christian families through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, educated in Ottoman service, and trained to a standard of discipline and skill that most European armies of the period would have found difficult to match. Around the Janissaries were organized the provincial cavalry, the Sipahis, who held land grants in exchange for military service in a system that bore some resemblance to European feudalism but worked differently in important ways. Artillery, logistics, engineering units, and allied contingents from the Crimean Tatars and the rebellious Hungarian nobles rounded out a force that contemporaries estimated at between 140,000 and 200,000 men. The march to Vienna took months. The army moved with the deliberate, systematic pace of a force confident in its own strength, stopping to besiege and capture fortresses along the route, accepting surrenders, and establishing the supply lines that would be needed for a sustained siege. It crossed into Habsburg territory in late June 1683 and arrived before Vienna on July 14th. Vienna's defenders were in a desperate situation from the first day. Emperor Leopold I had fled the city before the Ottomans arrived, which was tactically sensible and politically embarrassing. He left behind Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg in command of a garrison that had been reinforced before the siege began, but was still dramatically outnumbered. The city's civilian population of around 60,000 people was trapped inside walls that had been built in an earlier era of warfare, and were not fully adapted to resist the kind of systematic artillery bombardment and mine-digging that the Ottomans specialized in. Kara Mustafa's siege technique was methodical and effective. Ottoman engineers began digging approach trenches toward the walls, gradually moving closer while protected from defensive fire. Mining teams dug tunnels under the walls and packed them with powder, collapsing sections of the fortifications in controlled explosions. The defenders countermined frantically, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman mines before they could be detonated. Under the ground outside Vienna's walls, a parallel underground war was being fought simultaneously with the battle above the surface. Small groups of men in narrow tunnels encountering each other in the dark with knives and improvised weapons. By late August, Starhemberg's garrison was in serious trouble. Disease had reduced the effective fighting force further. Food supplies were running low. Sections of the walls had been badly damaged. He was sending increasingly desperate signals to the relief army that he knew was assembling, asking how long he could hold and receiving optimistic estimates that were becoming harder to believe with each passing day. In the final days of the siege, the city's defenders were blowing up their own suburb of the Burg to deny the Ottomans a covered approach to the remaining walls. The situation was measured in days rather than weeks. The coalition that assembled to relieve Vienna was a diplomatic achievement that deserves as much attention as the battle itself. Pope Innocent XI provided the money and the political pressure that brought the German princes into the alliance. He had been working for years to organize Christian solidarity against the Ottoman advance, and the crisis of 1683 gave him the emergency he needed to overcome the usual disputes about precedence and payment that prevented such coalitions from forming. He contributed approximately 2.5 million florins from papal funds, a substantial sum that helped finance the campaign. Emperor Leopold I negotiated a mutual defense treaty with Jan Sobieski of Poland in March 1683, before the siege began, which committed the Poles to come to Vienna's defense if the city was threatened. Sobieski had his own reasons for fighting the Ottomans, Poland having been in intermittent conflict with the Ottoman Empire for decades. He was an experienced military commander who had defeated Ottoman forces at the Battle of Khotin in 1673 and was one of the more capable generals in Europe. The treaty gave both sides what they needed. Leopold got a promise of Polish military assistance. Sobieski got a chance to position himself as the defender of Christendom, which was exactly the kind of reputation a Polish king needed. The German princes of the Holy Roman Empire contributed contingents under the command of Charles of Lorraine, who had been organizing the defense of Habsburg territories and coordinating with Sobieski on the relief plan. Bavaria contributed troops under Maximilian Emanuel, who was 20 years old and eager to prove himself. Saxony contributed. Various smaller German principalities contributed what they could. The combined force of around 80,000 men assembled in the hills above Vienna over the first 2 weeks of September. Sobieski commanded the right wing, where his Polish cavalry was concentrated. Charles of Lorraine commanded the left. The plan was straightforward in concept and difficult in execution. Advance down the Kahlenberg Ridge, engage the Ottoman forces defending against the relief army, and break through to the city. The terrain was steep and wooded, not ideal for the cavalry that was expected to deliver the decisive blow. The advance on September 12th took most of the day, the infantry fighting through the woods and vineyards on the ridge while the cavalry waited for open ground. By mid-afternoon, the Allied infantry had cleared enough space for cavalry deployment on the plain below. Sobieski ordered the charge. Around 20,000 horsemen, including 3,000 of the famous Polish winged hussars with their distinctive feathered lances, came down the slope at full gallop into the flank of the Ottoman army. It was the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. The Ottoman forces, which had been focused on the city walls and were caught partially off balance by the speed and scale of the assault, broke. Within hours, the entire Ottoman camp was in retreat, abandoning their supplies, their artillery, their tents, and their carefully prepared siege lines. Sobieski entered the Ottoman camp that evening and wrote to Pope Innocent XI, "We came, we saw, God conquered." He was paraphrasing Caesar and attributing the victory to divine intervention simultaneously, which was perfectly calibrated for his audience. In the abandoned Ottoman tents, the Allied soldiers found extraordinary quantities of supplies, weapons, gold, and something else, large sacks of an unfamiliar substance that nobody in the Christian army quite knew what to do with. The substance was coffee. Within a decade, coffee houses serving Ottoman-style coffee would be operating across Vienna and spreading through Europe. The Ottomans left behind, among their military equipment, one of the more consequential cultural imports in European history. The defeat at Vienna was not simply a matter of a relief army arriving at the right moment. It reflected deeper problems in the Ottoman military and political system that had been building for decades, and that the siege brought to the surface in ways the empire could not ignore. Kara Mustafa made a decision during the siege that military historians have been second-guessing ever since. He chose not to storm the city in the first weeks, when the defenders were still adjusting and before the full defensive organization was in place. Instead, he pursued the methodical siege approach, grinding down the walls over weeks while his main force screened against any relief attempt. His reasoning was probably that a direct assault would cost enormous casualties among his elite janissaries, and that the systematic approach would deliver the city intact with its wealth and population available for exploitation rather than destroyed in street fighting. The calculation might have been correct if the relief army had not arrived. But the relief army was always a possibility, and the time the methodical approach required gave the coalition the weeks it needed to assemble, march, and deploy. A bolder commander might have stormed the city in late July and presented the arriving relief force with an accomplished fact. Kara Mustafa's caution, or his preference for preserving his forces, cost him the campaign. There was also a structural problem with Ottoman military power that Vienna exposed. The janissaries, who had been the empire's primary military advantage for 2 centuries, had changed in ways that reduced their effectiveness. The devshirme system that had supplied them with recruits from Christian families had effectively ended by the early 17th century, replaced by a system where existing janissaries enrolled their own sons and sons of other Muslims. The corps had grown from an elite military force of perhaps 12,000 men under Suleiman to a political and economic institution numbering around 50,000, many of whom had civilian trades and who regarded their military status as a source of income and privilege rather than as a primary vocation. The military effectiveness of the janissaries at Vienna was real, but it was diminished compared to their 16th century predecessors. The Ottoman cavalry arm, the Sipahis, faced parallel problems. The Timar system of land grants in exchange for military service worked well in an expanding empire where there was always new land to distribute to successful warriors. In a stable empire with fixed borders, the system became a fixed aristocracy whose military obligations were increasingly difficult to enforce. The cavalry that appeared at Vienna was less effective per unit than the cavalry Suleiman had commanded a century and a half earlier, not because the individual soldiers were worse, but because the institutional incentives had changed. The Allied Christian forces at Vienna, by contrast, had been developing in the direction of professional standing armies paid by state revenues rather than by land grants. The discipline, the standardized weapons, and the coordinated tactical doctrine that the Allied forces demonstrated at Vienna reflected decades of development in European military organization, driven partly by the continuous pressure of the Ottoman threat and partly by the internal European conflicts, especially the 30 Years' War, that had forced military innovation as a condition of survival. The Ottoman defeat at Vienna did not end the war. It ended the Ottoman advance. Those are different things, and the distinction matters for understanding what Vienna actually decided. The years immediately following 1683 were militarily disastrous for the Ottomans. The Allied forces, emboldened by the victory at Vienna and organized into the Holy League by papal diplomacy, went on the offensive across multiple fronts. Charles of Lorraine recaptured Buda in 1686 after a siege that ended a century and a half of Ottoman control over the Hungarian capital. Venice launched operations in Greece, temporarily capturing the Peloponnese in a campaign memorable partly because a Venetian artillery shell hit the Parthenon in Athens, which the Ottomans were using as a powder magazine, destroying the interior of the 2,000-year-old temple in a single explosion. Eugene of Savoy, who would become the most celebrated general of the era, destroyed an Ottoman army at the Battle of Zenta in 1697 with a tactical brilliance that left 20,000 Ottoman soldiers dead and the Grand Vizier among the casualties. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized the Ottoman losses. Hungary, Transylvania, and Slavonia passed to the Habsburgs. Poland received Podolia. Venice kept most of its Greek acquisitions. It was the first major treaty in which the Ottoman Empire surrendered significant territory to Christian powers rather than gaining it, and it established a pattern that would define the next 2 centuries of Ottoman history. The empire that had spent 3 centuries expanding had begun contracting, slowly at first and then with increasing speed. The reasons for the reversal go beyond the Battle of Vienna itself. European military technology and organization had been developing at a pace that the Ottoman Empire was not matching. The reasons for this divergence are genuinely complex, and historians disagree about their relative importance. The Ottoman economy, based heavily on agriculture and trade rather than manufacturing, did not generate the surplus capital that funded European weapons development. The political power of the Janissary Corps made military reform extremely difficult, because any reform that threatened their privileges would trigger the kind of violent resistance that had overthrown sultans before. The religious and intellectual climate of the empire, while sophisticated in many ways, was less hospitable to the kind of empirical scientific development that was beginning to accelerate European technological capability in the late 17th century. What is clear is that the gap that appeared at Vienna in 1683 widened consistently over the following 2 centuries. The Ottoman Empire fought defensive wars with increasing difficulty against powers whose military capability was growing faster than its own. It survived into the 20th century, but as the sick man of Europe rather than its most formidable military power. The final dissolution came in 1922, when the empire that had terrified Europe for 3 centuries ceased to exist. The question in this video's title, Why Europe Doesn't Speak Arabic, requires a small clarification that matters. The Ottomans were not an Arab empire. They were a Turkish dynasty ruling a multilingual empire that included Arabs, Greeks, Slavs, Armenians, Hungarians, and dozens of other peoples. The official language of the Ottoman court was Ottoman Turkish, a heavily Arabic and Persian-influenced literary language that was quite different from the Turkish spoken on the streets. If the Ottomans had taken Vienna and pushed further west, Europe would not have become Arabic-speaking. It would have become part of an Ottoman imperial system that accommodated enormous linguistic diversity while imposing administrative and religious frameworks on conquered territories. But the point behind the question is real. A Europe in which the Ottoman Empire had broken through at Vienna and continued west would have been a fundamentally different place. The Habsburg Empire that resisted Ottoman expansion was also the primary bulwark of Catholic political order against the Protestant Reformation. An Ottoman breakthrough would have changed the balance of power in ways that would have altered the religious, political, and ultimately cultural trajectory of the continent in ways that are genuinely impossible to predict. What actually happened was this. The Ottoman defeat at Vienna accelerated a shift that had already begun, from an era in which Europe's primary external pressure came from the East and South to an era in which Europe's primary external pressure was its own internal competition. The Habsburgs, freed from the existential Ottoman threat by the victories of the 1680s and 1690s, could refocus their attention on France and on the management of their own territories. The energy and resources that had been consumed by the Ottoman frontier were redirected into the internal European rivalries that would dominate the 18th century. Jan Sobieski rode back to Poland after Vienna, expecting the kind of gratitude that saving European civilization ought to generate. He received considerably less than he expected. Emperor Leopold I, who had fled Vienna before the siege and returned after the victory, was not especially enthusiastic about acknowledging how much he owed the Polish king. The alliance that had saved Vienna dissolved quickly into the ordinary frictions of competing national interests. Sobieski died in 1696, 13 years after his great victory, with Poland's political situation considerably worse than it had been, and his reputation as the savior of Vienna not translating into the practical political advantages he had hoped for. The man who saved Europe from the Ottomans was rewarded with the indifference of the people he had saved. History offers few cleaner examples of the gap between military glory and political outcome. Kara Mustafa was strangled in Belgrade on December 25, 1683, 3 months after the defeat. The silk cord was the Ottoman state's standard method of executing high officials, considered more dignified than beheading. He had commanded the largest army assembled in Europe in a century and had failed to take a city that would have opened the road to Western Europe. From the Sultan's perspective, there was not much else to say about him. The coffee that the Allied soldiers found in the abandoned Ottoman camp reached Vienna's coffeehouses within the year. A Polish officer named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who had served as an interpreter during the crisis and had passed through Ottoman lines carrying messages between the besieged city and the relief army, is credited by Viennese tradition with opening the first Viennese coffeehouse using beans captured from the Ottoman supply train. The story is probably somewhat embellished, but something like it happened. The Ottomans came to Vienna to conquer it and left behind, along with their dead and their abandoned artillery, the beverage that would fuel European intellectual life for the next 3 centuries. They lost the battle. They changed the mornings,